When a strict substitute teacher takes over, a once lively classroom turns cold with fear until a quiet, underestimated student challenges her authority in a way no one sees coming. The students fumble to open their math books, the nervous energy in the room palpable. The air felt heavier than usual, as if the walls of the classroom were closing in on them. They had always looked forward to Mrs. Bianca's lessons, where learning was fun and full of encouragement. But now, they didn't know what to expect. Mrs. Spencer's cold tone left them with an uneasy feeling, as if they had to prove themselves just to get through the day. Amanda Jacob, sitting near the front, looked around the classroom. Her heart raced, unsure how to handle this new teacher. Amanda was one of the brightest students in the class, always quick to answer questions and eager to help others. But Mrs. Spencer's stern presence made her question herself for the first time. She avoided looking at her classmates, focusing only on the book in front of her, hoping that the lesson would pass quickly. Mrs. Spencer stood at the front, her hands gripping the edge of the desk. She glared at the class, then wrote a question on the board. What is 7 times 8? The question seemed simple enough, but the way Mrs. Spencer stared at them made it feel like a test of more than just math knowledge. She expected everyone to answer quickly, and there was an uncomfortable silence as the students hesitated. Amanda raised her hand slowly, unsure if she was making the right choice. Mrs. Spencer's gaze shot over to her, but there was no warm acknowledgement, no nod of encouragement like Mrs. Bianca used to give. Mrs. Spencer just pointed at her. "Go ahead," Mrs. Spencer said sharply. Amanda spoke up, her voice a little shaky but confident. "It's 56. Mrs. Spencer didn't even blink. "Is that all? You think you can just say the answer and that's enough?" The students looked at each other, surprised. Amanda had given the right answer, but Mrs. Spencer didn't seem satisfied. She expected more. Amanda's face flushed red with embarrassment. Her classmates could feel the tension rising as they realized Mrs. Spencer wasn't interested in easy answers or friendly smiles. She wanted them to struggle. "No one cares about the answer if you don't explain how you got it," Mrs. Spencer continued, her tone colder than ever. "Next time, show your work. I'm not here to coddle you." The room fell into an awkward silence. Amanda's heart sank, but she nodded, knowing there was no point in arguing. She had never been spoken to this way before, and it stung. The students quickly returned to their books, heads down, trying to avoid drawing attention to themselves. Jennifer Rowland, sitting near the back of the room, was a shy 12-year-old girl who often kept to herself. She didn't like to speak up, even when she knew the answer. But today, she felt a growing sense of frustration. Mrs. Spencer's harshness was making it hard to concentrate. It was as if the joy of learning had been sucked right out of the room. Jennifer's hand shook slightly as she held her pencil, unsure of what to do. As Mrs. Spencer began to write more problems on the board, Jennifer hesitated. Should she speak up? What would Mrs. Spencer say if she did? She tried to block out the fear and focus on the work, but the classroom felt colder with each passing second, as if no one was allowed to make a mistake or ask for help. Jamal Thompson, a quiet boy known for his intelligence, stared at his desk. He was usually the type of student who observed everything around him before speaking. He could see his classmates' discomfort, and he shared their unease. But unlike Amanda or Jennifer, Jamal wasn't quick to show his emotions. He stayed quiet, letting his mind focus on the work at hand. Mrs. Spencer turned to the board again, writing more problems with her back to the class. The students were trying to adjust, but it was clear that things were not going to be the same as before. Mrs. Bianca's cheerful voice was replaced by Mrs. Spencer's sharp commands. The students didn't feel like they were in a safe space anymore. They didn't feel like they could make mistakes or ask questions. The class moved forward, each moment filled with the weight of uncertainty. And as the lesson continued, the students couldn't help but wonder, how would they survive the next 3 months under Mrs. Spencer's rule? The atmosphere in Green Hills School had changed completely. Just a few weeks ago, the students had entered their classroom with excitement, eager to see what fun and creative ways Mrs. Bianca would use to teach them. Now, the air felt heavy, weighed down by the presence of Mrs. Spencer. She ran the class like a military drill, barking orders, demanding answers, and frowning at anything less than absolute perfection. The students no longer felt safe to express themselves. They sat stiffly in their seats, their eyes glued to their books, hoping to avoid her wrath. Amanda Jacob, usually the most confident in the class, felt herself growing quieter with each passing day. She had always loved math, always been the first to raise her hand. But after Mrs. Spencer had embarrassed her for giving a correct answer too simply, she hesitated more. One morning, Mrs. Spencer stood at the front of the class, her hands folded behind her back. "Today," she announced, "we will be solving a problem on angles. Since you all think you know everything, let's see how well you do." She turned to the board and wrote, "Find the sum of the angles on a straight line. Show your full working." A hush fell over the classroom. The question wasn't difficult. They had done similar problems before. But under Mrs. Spencer's sharp gaze, the students hesitated. No one wanted to be the next target of her criticism. After a long silence, Amanda swallowed her fear and raised her hand. She knew the answer. Mrs. Spencer's eyes locked onto her. "Well, at least someone is brave enough," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Go ahead." Amanda stood slowly, feeling her classmates' eyes on her. "The answer is 180 degrees, she said firmly. Mrs. Spencer raised an eyebrow. "Oh, just like that? No explanation?" Amanda hesitated. "Well, on a straight line, the angles always add up to 180 degrees because..." Mrs. Spencer cut her off. "That's not good enough." Amanda's stomach twisted. "But that's the rule." "The rule?" Mrs. Spencer scoffed. "A real student wouldn't just memorize answers. A real student would be able to prove it. Come to the board and solve it properly." Amanda's hands trembled as she picked up the chalk. She could hear whispers behind her. She wrote down the equation as she had learned it. Angle A plus angle B equals 180 degrees. She turned to Mrs. Spencer, hoping this would be enough. Mrs. Spencer sighed dramatically. "Pathetic. Where is the theorem? Where is the step-by-step reasoning? You think just writing a number makes you smart." Amanda's face burned. The students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't how Mrs. Bianca had taught them. Mrs. Bianca always made them feel proud of their knowledge, not ashamed of it. Jennifer Rowland, sitting at the back of the classroom, watched with a mix of fear and frustration. She hated confrontation. She hated being the center of attention. But as she saw Amanda standing there, humiliated, something inside her stirred. Jennifer had always been good at math. She had the answer, and she knew she could explain it better than Mrs. Spencer was allowing. But speaking up in front of the whole class, that was terrifying. Mrs. Spencer crossed her arms. "Does anyone else want to embarrass themselves?" The class remained silent. Jennifer's heart pounded. She looked at Amanda, then at the other students, all too afraid to speak. And then, before she could stop herself, she raised her hand. Mrs. Spencer's sharp eyes darted to her. "Yes," she said impatiently. Jennifer stood, her legs shaking. I can explain it." The class gasped. Jennifer hardly ever spoke up. Even Amanda looked at her in surprise. Mrs. Spencer smirked. "Oh, let's hear it, then." Jennifer took a deep breath. Her voice was soft but steady. "The sum of the angles on a straight line is always 180 degrees because a straight angle is equal to half of a full rotation, which is 360 degrees. If you divide that in half, you get 180 degrees. That's why no matter how many angles are on a straight line, their total must always add up to 180 degrees." Silence. Mrs. Spencer blinked, as if caught off guard. For a moment, she had nothing to say. Then she laughed. A short, cold laugh. "That's a very basic explanation," she said dismissively. But I suppose it's not wrong. Jennifer lowered her eyes, but inside, something had changed. She had stood up to Mrs. Spencer. She had spoken her mind. The other students exchanged glances. Maybe they didn't have to be afraid. Maybe Mrs. Spencer wasn't as powerful as she wanted them to think. Mrs. Spencer turned back to the board. We'll continue tomorrow. Be prepared. As the bell rang and the students packed up their things, Amanda leaned over to Jennifer. Thank you, she whispered. Jennifer smiled shyly. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Little did they know, things were only going to get more intense from here. The classroom was still. The weight of Mrs. Spencer's words lingered in the air. Jennifer Rowland stood at her desk, her heart pounding in her chest. The other students sat frozen, their eyes darting between Jennifer and Mrs. Spencer, waiting for what would happen next. Jennifer was not used to being the center of attention. She was the kind of girl who preferred to observe rather than participate. She had never been the loudest or the boldest. But today, something had pushed her to speak up. Maybe it was Amanda's humiliation the day before. Maybe it was the way Mrs. Spencer made them all feel small. Maybe it was the simple fact that Jennifer knew she was right. Mrs. Spencer stared at her, tapping her fingers impatiently against her desk. Fine, she said at last, her voice clipped. You're correct, but you should have done it more thoroughly. Jennifer exhaled, realizing she had been holding her breath. She expected to feel embarrassed, to regret speaking up. But instead, she felt something else, a strange sense of pride. Mrs. Spencer turned her back on the class, writing another equation on the board. But the mood in the room had changed. The other students looked at Jennifer with something new in their eyes. Respect. Amanda leaned over, whispering. That was amazing. Jennifer didn't know what to say. She simply nodded, her cheeks warm. But Mrs. Spencer was not done. If you all think you're so smart, let's see how well you handle this, she said, stepping aside to reveal a much more complex problem on the board. Solve for x. 5x plus 32x. 4 equals 26. The students exchanged nervous glances. This wasn't an impossible equation, but it was much harder than what they were used to. Mrs. Spencer's eyes roamed the classroom, looking for a victim. And then she smiled. A cruel, knowing smile. Jamal Thompson, she called. A hush fell over the room. Jamal was known for being the quietest student in the class. He rarely spoke unless called upon, and even then, he barely said more than a few words. But what most of the class didn't know, what even Mrs. Spencer didn't know, was that Jamal was not just good at math. He was a genius. Jamal hesitated for a moment before standing up. He adjusted his glasses, then walked slowly to the front of the room. The students watched him with wide eyes. Mrs. Spencer smirked. She was expecting him to fail. She wanted him to stumble, to struggle, to prove that she was superior. Jamal took the chalk and studied the equation. Then, with calm precision, he began to write. 5x plus 6x, 12 equals 26. 11x, 12 equals 26. 11x equals 38. Equals 38 elephants. He set the chalk down and turned back to face the class. Silence. Mrs. Spencer's smile faded. She stared at the board, blinking. Jamal had solved the equation in seconds. No hesitation. No mistakes. The class erupted into whispers. How did he do that so fast? I didn't even get past the first step. He's never answered a question in class before. Mrs. Spencer's face darkened. She cleared her throat. That's acceptable, she said stiffly. But next time, show every single step. Jamal didn't argue. He simply walked back to his seat, unfazed. Jennifer and Amanda exchanged looks. Something had shifted in the classroom. For weeks, Mrs. Spencer had made them doubt themselves. She had belittled their intelligence, crushed their confidence. But today, for the first time, she had been caught off guard. And the students had seen it. Maybe Mrs. Spencer wasn't as powerful as she wanted them to think. Maybe they weren't as helpless as they had started to believe. The following week, the students of Green Hills School entered their classroom with a newfound energy. The fear that had once kept them silent was beginning to fade. Mrs. Spencer was still their teacher, but something had changed. Jennifer, Amanda, and the rest of the class had seen through her tactics. They understood now that her authority wasn't built on true knowledge or wisdom. It was built on intimidation. And once you stopped being afraid, her power disappeared. Mrs. Spencer, however, did not notice this shift. She still believed she had full control over the class. That morning, she stood at the front of the room, a smirk on her lips, ready to humiliate another student. She scanned the room, her sharp eyes landing on Jamal Thompson. Jamal had always been the quiet one, the observer. He never spoke unless he had to, and he never boasted about his intelligence. But after solving the equation so easily the previous week, the class had started looking at him differently. Mrs. Spencer, on the other hand, was determined to put him in his place. "Jamal," she said, crossing her arms, "since you seem to think you're smarter than everyone else, let's see just how brilliant you really are." The class tensed. They knew what she was trying to do. Mrs. Spencer turned to the board and wrote a long, complex algebraic equation. It was far more advanced than anything they had covered. She stepped aside and gestured toward the board. "Go ahead," she said, a smug expression on her face. "Solve it." A hush fell over the room. This was a trap. Mrs. Spencer had purposely chosen a problem she believed was too difficult for Jamal. She wanted to see him fail. Jamal stood up, adjusting his glasses. He didn't hesitate. He walked to the front of the room, picked up the chalk, and began writing. The students watched in awe. His movements were quick and precise, his handwriting neat and confident. He worked through the equation step by step, not pausing, not second-guessing himself. Within seconds, he finished. Jamal turned around, dusting his hands off. "That's the answer." The classroom was silent. Mrs. Spencer blinked. She stared at the board as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. "This," she muttered, her eyes narrowing. She grabbed the chalk and quickly checked Jamal's work, running through the calculations herself. Her face turned red. He was right. A murmur spread through the class. Jennifer and Amanda exchanged excited glances. Their quiet classmate, the one who never spoke, had just done something incredible. Mrs. Spencer clenched her jaw. She refused to accept it. "You solved it too quickly," she snapped. "There's no way you could have done it right without cheating." Jamal didn't react. He simply stepped back, meeting her gaze. "You just checked it," he said calmly. "It's right." Mrs. Spencer's frustration grew. She turned back to the board, as if trying to find a mistake that wasn't there. The students saw it now. It wasn't about Jamal's answer. It was about Mrs. Spencer's pride. She couldn't handle the fact that one of her students was smarter than she was. Jennifer stood up. "Why can't you just admit that he's right?" Amanda stood too. "Yeah, you always tell us to show our work." He did. "What's the problem?" More students joined in. "He got the answer fair and square. You just don't want to admit he's better than you." "This is wrong." Mrs. Spencer's face paled. She was losing them. For the first time since she arrived, the class was standing up to her. They weren't afraid anymore. Jamal, however, remained composed. "You don't have to believe me," he said, "but you should believe the math." Mrs. Spencer opened her mouth, then closed it. She had no comeback, no insults, no way to regain control. The class erupted into cheers. That was the moment she realized she had lost. The return of Mrs. Bianca. As the term drew to a close, something even more unexpected happened. One morning, the students arrived to find a familiar face standing at the front of the room. Mrs. Bianca. Her warm smile filled the room with the energy they had missed so much. "I couldn't stay away too long," she said, laughing. "I heard you all had quite an eventful term." The students beamed. They had missed her so much. She glanced around the room, her eyes landing on Jennifer, Amanda, and Jamal. I heard some of you found your voices. Jennifer blushed, Amanda grinned, and Jamal simply nodded. Mrs. Bianca's gaze softened. I am so proud of you all. From the corner of the room, Mrs. Spencer sat stiffly, her lips pressed into a thin line. She had been completely overshadowed, her authority dismantled by the very students she had tried to control. The class, once filled with fear, was now filled with confidence. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to inspire others. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in their place? Let's talk.